All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you who are coming to us from all over the world. Hello and welcome to San Diego State University and the Fowler College of Business. My name is Mark Ballum. I serve as Managing Director of our Wendy Gillespie Center for Advancing Global Business. The mission of the center is to expand international curriculum, international business research, and engagement between academia and other global organizations. Our center provides students with meaningful global learning experiences, assists professors in internationalizing curriculum, and supports companies looking to expand globally. Our goal is to link academia with business and train students with a global perspective. You can learn more about the Wendy Gillespie Center for Advancing Global Business and how you can support and engage with us by clicking on the link provided in the chat box. I'm pleased to welcome you to our 2023 Global Risk Forecast. I want to send a special shout out to our center's board member, Greg Hubler, and his team at Sibylline, and thank them for helping to organize today's event. Today's attendees can receive a copy of Sibylline's 2023 Global Risk Forecast by emailing Greg at the email posted in the chat box. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dan Moshavi, the Thomas and Evelyn Page Dean of the Fowler College of Business. Dean Moshavi will be the moderator for today's webinar.
Thanks, Mark.
Dean Moshavi.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Appreciate you being here today with us. Fowler College of Business at San Diego State is pleased to partner with Sibylline on the 2023 Global Risk Forecast. Certainly, as I watch the news, we all feel this way at various times right now. It feels like there's a lot of risk, a lot of uncertainty. So I think the timing of this event is terrific. And to lead us down this path of things we should be paying attention to, it's my pleasure to welcome Justin Crump, founder and CEO of Sibylline Limited, a strategic risk advisory firm. Justin comes to us today from Sibylline headquarters in London. And he's joined by Gareth Westwood, head of global intelligence for Sibylline. Justin and Gareth, it's a pleasure to welcome you both to San Diego State University virtually, and we look forward to your insights. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dean, and hi, everyone. Yeah, I wish I was actually at the university right now. I'm just back from California, and it's been a bit of a shock getting back to the UK in early February after the weather in California. Although I know you're all complaining about how cold it is and the rain you've had recently and everything else, but nonetheless, I can assure you, you have it considerably better off than we do. It is great to speak to you all. As mentioned, Sibylline is a firm you probably haven't necessarily heard of, but we work very hard on understanding the world to help you, help your businesses or your future businesses, your endeavors, and focused on keeping staff of large corporations mainly safe, along with their market access, their assets, their reputation, their technology. We also work with NGOs and actually support a number of universities, often in their study abroad programs and things like that, as well as on the more academic side. So it's great to speak to you all, regardless of what hat you're wearing today. And I hope you find something interesting to take away. If nothing else, we all live on this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous planet as it is at the moment. I've been saying that for about 20 years, but it feels like it's getting much more that way at the moment, as you'll probably all agree, just looking at the news, and that's even before Chinese spy balloons meandering across the United States and various parts of Latin America, as we've been tracking over the last week. The firm itself, I can't claim credit for what you're about to hear. We have a team of about 500 analysts worldwide, concentrated though in the United States. The headquarters of the analytical team is in London, and that's run by Gareth. And I'll let him introduce himself in a second, but they're focused there because of the time zone. It means, especially if you're sales on the West Coast, we've hopefully worked everything else before you have to get up and read about it. So it works very well for you, hopefully. They're deliberately concentrated to be able to share ideas about what we're seeing around the world, and particularly the interconnectedness between events. I'm a big believer that the world is a system of systems, that nothing happens in isolation, and things, as just in the last 24 hours, these horrendous earthquakes in Turkey, obviously the shockwaves and repercussions of those are going to be felt much more widely than the immediate impacts. as is the case with nearly everything that happens these days. And the very fact to you from the UK via Zoom so easily and communicate in the way we can just shows how much more things will travel and have consequences. So we work very hard on understanding the implications of events and trying to bring out the so what. So that's what we're going to give you a taste of for about half an hour, obviously at a very high, very global level, but we wanted to give time for questions that people hopefully always have to dig more deeply into what matters to you, and to be able to help you walk away hopefully with a bit more insight for your businesses or just for yourselves. So do think of those questions, and there's all sorts of ways you can put them into this. Obviously the chat, the Q&A are the traditional ones, and I'm sure we'll get some questions from the Dean as well. It'll take me back about 20 years getting asked searching academic questions, but I'm ready for it, I promise. My own background, why I do this strange thing, this field that many of you may not have heard of corporate intelligence work. I went to university and joined the Army Reserves in the UK. We have a little bit of a different setup with the way the military works. We don't get support for university or anything else, but joining the reserves, equivalent of National Guard roughly, gave me some good income through university, and frankly, getting paid to drive a tank around the countryside beat working in a coffee shop, frankly, for me. I'd much rather be doing that for my weekends. And I really enjoyed it, but it was the 90s. And frankly, the thing we were debating at university was the end of history. Francis Fukuyama's theory, this is all over. There is no more history to be had. Liberal democracy has won, and this is just the end game. To be fair, I met with Fukuyama, and even he didn't believe it. I'll be fair, but it was a theory at the time, which basically said, what is next? Then a very nice bank called Chase Manhattan came along and offered me a lovely job in London doing mergers and acquisitions. And when I looked at the two, I realized I could command a tank at the weekends and be an M&A banker during the week. And that was a pretty good balance of life, particularly for my then girlfriend. So she rather persuaded me to take the job in London and keep the army up as a hobby, because who was going to need to go to war anyway? Again, end of history. Fast forward about 2 years, September 11th, 2001. After which I volunteered to go full time with the military, because my sense was that the world had changed, and this world of business. And funny enough, my first ever foreign banking trip was to Manhattan, and the abiding memory of the Twin Towers and the skyline. So over those 2 years, I kind of saw that transition from business and this world of the future, very rapidly, to the kind of security threats that, to be fair, I'd studied, but were very theoretical, becoming very real. So I went away with the army. I went to Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and I served with the intelligence services at what's called GCHQ, which is the equivalent and very close partner of the NSA. I didn't do anything terribly exciting there, I can promise you, but it was very interesting work regardless. And I ended up back in the corporate sector, but this time as an intelligence analyst rather than the financial one. And I did that for a little while before starting a business with a name that is excellent, apart from the fact that no one can spell it. Most people can't pronounce it, although thank you, Dean and Mark, for getting that right. And we didn't own the domain name. It's taken us 13 years to get the .com. But apart from that, it was a wonderful business plan. And so take that on board if you're a business student. And the reason being, again, I just didn't feel this stuff was being done very well. I'd ended up in this field more or less by accident. I worked for a firm that had about 10 people. I found the work fascinating. And I remember the first time that I was watching the news, reading the paper, and realized, it's going to sound arrogant, but realized I knew more about every story that I looked at or heard. And that really woke me up to the possibilities that would exist in actually helping corporate clients who frankly are much more easy to deal with than government, because corporations generally have an idea what they're doing, and governments in the nicest way generally don't, because of a thing called politics. And it was great working with corporate clients who kind of had real life problems, immediate problems. You could help very quickly. It was very impactful. There's a very close feedback loop, and people really benefited. And it is a weird thing that in the military, we have intelligence at every level next to every decision maker. There's always an intelligence officer for a commander who focuses on the, if you like, the business picture, internal and external, the market picture, etc. That didn't exist in business. And it's absolutely bizarre, because no one now would go to war without an intelligence function. And yet businesses still try and compete in a very difficult global market with very little intelligence. There's lots of things called intelligence, they're not intelligence, and they're not applied using intelligence theory. So I do this with a passion, as does Greg, one of your board directors mentioned, and as does Gareth. So I'll shut up there and just let Gareth introduce himself a little bit, and then we'll get on to telling you how dismal and awful the world is. Gareth, over to you.
Justin, thank you very much. And thank you Dan, for that introduction. Really good to be here. I'll keep this terse because I'm sure you're all keen to hear just how dreadful everything is from Justin and myself. But like Justin, military background. So after 6 years as a college lecturer, I joined the military in the intelligence corps, the Army Intelligence Corps in the UK, where I spent a number of years, most of that, like Justin, serving with the intelligence agencies, mainly, again, like Justin, GCHQ, although that happens to be a happy coincidence and not by design. I then spent 4 years living in Afghanistan and Pakistan, doing threat work for our Foreign Office, so our Department of State, mainly working in the embassies in Islamabad and Kabul. And then I decided to come out of the public sector because my wife couldn't believe that being a diplomat abroad was as hard as I was making it out to be. So I come and I decided, like Justin, I had a passion for doing this thing right, and I noticed again that this wasn't being done right in the private sector, particularly, I must say, on our side of the pond, which in-house teams anyway, have been quite slow to catch on to this, whereas I think, over in the US, I see in-house teams being a bit more mature. So as such, I was recruited to build and then manage the global intelligence function for a pharmaceutical company called AstraZeneca, just about the time they were doing all fancy things with COVID vaccines. And I did that for a couple of years and gained great insight there. During that time at AstraZeneca, I relied heavily on corporate intelligence vendors. And one of those, primarily, in fact, was Sibylline. And that's where I become au fait with Sibylline's work and was introduced to the rigor, but the passion with which they approached what they did. And I decided I didn't want to refer to Sibylline as they anymore, but rather us. So I made the jump a few months ago now, and I have the great pleasure to be overseeing I think it's 26-30, I lose track, person team of incredibly bright intelligence analysts that are roughly split into 4 international desks covering the globe. We also have special interest analysts in themes such as extremism, ESG, and cyber as well, who, as Justin quite rightly said, monitor the globe and try to understand the world around us 24 hours a day. So it's my great pleasure to oversee what they do. And trust me, anything I say today will be by conduity of the far greater minds than I back in London, who contribute every day to our extensive suite of reporting. So that's who I am, and that's who I oversee. So without further ado, for the doom and gloom, I hand back over to Justin.
Thanks, Gareth. And yeah, we're given a very bad impression that we're all British ex-military and intelligence services. And actually, I think we're pretty much the only two from that team. But I am, I mentioned it slightly because I am a strong believer in what I gained from military experience and bringing that back to the world of business, not just in intelligence and security, but in leadership and dynamics. And I always like to throw that out as an aside. We don't have a veterans-owned business function in the UK. It's something I'm lobbying for, but I think there are some tremendous lessons from how the military gets things done in complex environments in the most prosaic, boring ways. And most people know that war is about logistics, but it is, really important about just getting things done against adversity. So there's some great things from that. So any of you who are interested in that, I'm always happy to, have my brains picked about it all. So moving ahead with the presentation, what was the big shock of the last year? Without doubt, Ukraine. Any opportunity to put up a war photograph, but my summer holidays last year were spent in Kyiv. And, it's pretty fascinating what is going on there, obviously, on top of this pretty awful humanitarian tragedy that's going on in the conflict. It's saying a lot about the state of play that we are up to in this century in terms of particularly great power competition. And we've had another reminder of that with what's going on with the US and China at the moment, culmination of a long period. And of course, to those of you from business audience where the future was China for such a long period of time, suddenly there's all this stuff about you shouldn't have TikTok on your phone and balloons are out to get us. Before that, of course, we had the shocks of COVID, and Gareth and I can run back all the way through our careers of things that have come along and been shocking, but they're definitely coming at a faster rate, and there is a reason for that. But Ukraine remains the most dangerous point of impact. So I mentioned this one because, you know, it isn't going away. It's a really, really important struggle, and it's a culmination of a lot of pressure. You know, the big question is this the beginning of something worse, or is this the culmination of something as we transition to something else? And I'll let you draw your own conclusions as we go through, and we can come back to it at the end. But it is, you know, it is a really, really important thing that's going on there. And I think, you know, we all pay attention to it. We got kind of used to it over the last year as being a thing, but the outcome of what happens there is going to be really critical. And from a personal note, the Ukrainians are showing an amazing amount of resilience in what they're doing, both militarily and civilian society. So there's a lot of lessons to be drawn out of that as well, and particularly resilience to Ukrainian businesses and operations in the face of the threat. As you mentioned, you can, by all means, you're most welcome, all of you, to a copy of our annual forecast. It's the only really long, boring document we do, but it's packed full of insight, and I think it will be interesting to some of you, especially if you can apply it for your businesses. So we were asked to make it available. I'm happy to do so. And again, I can't claim credit for this, but it is the combined work of an awful lot of people who've kind of put their collective brains together to try and work out what's going on. So what I'm going to talk through really is the top layer of that. Everyone will have a favorite subject. Like I said, things will apply to all of you in different levels, and you'll have something that you really care about. You might not care about some of the things I will talk about, but I'll try and persuade you. But again, it's all in there in detail. So if you want to go through that, pick our brains, again, feel free. It's great to hear from people, actually understand how people are using it or not. So, you know, I do encourage you to make the most. And hey, if you can see ways to make it better, we're always ears to that as well, because there's an awful lot to communicate, and trying to put shape around this morass of information is always quite challenging. But it does have 10 themes, and I'll put them all up. They are, I think, sort of largely self-explanatory from the titles. You could argue that many of them have applied for a number of years, and I'm happy with that idea, because although every year we can look at the world and try and come up with some themes to understand it, the reality is that things don't fit 365 days every time. So, you know, a number of these things are slow burning. Cost of living crisis, for example, is acute at the moment, but the we've called it different things over the years, but the differential of wealth is, of course, a lasting thing in that regard. Equally, the axis of the excluded, by which we mean nations such as Iran, North Korea, to an extent now, China, definitely Russia, Venezuela, you know, and probably quite a few others one could think of and name. There is a sort of axis between those, and we're seeing that very manifestly now. But the way in which the powers that, frankly, are basically anti-US, or the ones that have been left aside by the US, or are losers in a US-led world or a democratic world, they don't necessarily have very much in common. In fact, Russia and Iran were not terribly friendly to each other until they intervened in Syria. But there's Syria, that's another one, Gareth. You know, there's plenty in this list, but they combine around the fact that they really, really don't like a US-led world for a number of reasons. You know, I think they're often morally, ethically opposed to it for whatever reason, legitimate or otherwise, or they're realpolitik opposed, or a combination above, economically opposed. And you know, that competition has been very real. It didn't go away with the Cold War. It was masked, and my overall theme with a lot of this is we've had the 30 probably best years of world history we're going to see. You know, a sort of pretty blissful period of world peace, which might not sound like it when Gareth and I talk about where we went on our holidays for the last 20 years, but nonetheless, you know, it's been a pretty peaceful time. And many of the problems that we have in our global themes, climate change, cohesion, health risks, they're problems of growth. I mean, they're problems of the fact that we've got approaching 10 billion people on this planet. When my father was born, we had somewhere between 2 and 3 billion in 1936. There's just a lot more people here. There's a lot more people because we're really good at the moment at keeping people alive. Medical care has come on an incredible amount in 120 years. Back even in 1900, it was about 50-50 whether seeing a doctor would make you better or kill you. You know, it was kind of a roll of the dice, to be honest. And that's changed so radically, and we take some of this for granted. But again, we live in a time of unrivaled ease of doing business, convenience, and actually global cooperation. So it might not feel like it, but actually we do live in this great time. But that period of sort of comparative peace and quiet has you know, overshadowed the tectonic plates moving in the background. So again, no surprise we find ourselves where we are now when you look at the problems, but bear in mind they are problems of growth. And it's, I joke a bit about the doom and gloom. I mean, there's definitely more pressure building in the global environment, but these are problems of success. people are gunning for the US because the US is actually on top of the pile and has, found its way there through a variety of means, but fundamentally, liberal democracy has broadly been seen as a pretty good way forward. It's certainly the least bad system of systems out there, to paraphrase Churchill. So we are generally doing pretty well across these areas. So I always like to put that in context because it's easy to tear ourselves in knots over every tweet we see or something else, but that is the actual background. We're doing pretty well overall, and we shouldn't necessarily forget that in the face of some of the challenges we now face. And these are arguably sort of normal challenges to an extent, but we do actually live on a more peaceful planet than you would think in many ways. And long may that continue, but it does mean that the conflicts we do see are more shocking. And actually hand in glove with longer life expectancy, better healthcare and everything else, is it's even more tragic to lose an 18-year-old soldier, let's face it. And that's particularly been the case almost since the Second World War for Western militaries. Loss of life in warfare is considered pretty much unacceptable at this point. And that's a bit of a problem. And not everyone thinks like us. And that's something I think we've had problems getting our heads around occasionally with Russia and Ukraine in particular. So I'm going to take those 10 themes. As I said, you can read all about them in the report, but I'm going to turn them into sort of 5 themes to look at for you. And the first one is contested spaces. And what we're looking at here is that great power rivalry in particular, but also the competition for shrinking resources that we consider. And we're hand in glove with that as protectionism. And that's something obviously we've seen quite a lot of in the US and the UK in particular in various ways. And we're still working through some of the ramifications for how these things work when we look at the planet. And I think we haven't seen the end of it, of course. The great power rivalries occupy a variety of domains: economic, geographical, and actually geography does not go away. Great book, Prisoners of Geography, for those of you who might have read it, which actually argues the fact that the same fault lines will always come up again and again. And the fact that actually Gareth and I mentioned Iraq and Afghanistan, the Balkans, I mean, their places have been hotspots certainly for the last 100, 200 years. It's no surprise, that these places come up again and again because there are always reasons why they do. Some of them traditional geography, some of them human geography. But we definitely are seeing these rivalries, not helped, as I said, of course, by distraction within the US, within Western Europe, within the UK, within NATO, and other organizations that almost lacked a purpose for the last 30 years because it was pretty easy, actually. And that's allowed space for challenge to grow in a number of ways. The conflict with China, the one that we highlight the most, was never inevitable. I mean, I was in China, actually grew up in that part of the world. I was in China 2008 to 2010, and it was on a very different course then to what it was by 2015. I think a worthier course then. I think courses that we pursued in action alongside the Chinese made sense, and they've just taken a turn away for reasons of internal politics, for reasons of global power, prestige, for fear of some things coming from the US, for fear actually that their systems would not last if they were actually challenged with a degree of freedoms we are privileged to have in the US and Western Europe and other places. And China knew that maybe there was always going to be a cultural clash coming at some point. And so they have, I'm afraid to say, regressed certainly politically and become more protective and more confrontational. That did not just come from us, frankly. That is something that China has slightly brought upon itself in its actions and the way it's behaving. So it's not the end of it. That's the most obvious example. Obviously, Russia is playing up the most. And I like to draw a small parallel. If you imagine the global order as a house, the US has the nice room at the top. I'm not sure where the UK is in that analogy, probably somewhere in the wardrobe, but clinging on. But the US has a lovely room at the top. China has a less nice room in the house. It likes the house. It wants the room at the top. And Russia is in the living room flicking matches around, hoping the whole thing burns down to some extent, right? Because it doesn't even like the house. It doesn't like the other people it's housemates with. So Russia's trying to tear it all down. China doesn't want it torn down, but it does want the US out of the good room. It's a very crude analogy, but it's a way of thinking a difference between what Russia's doing and what China's doing. Of the two, one is obviously much more powerful and has deeper pockets and resources, and that is China. Russia, frankly, not a powerful country or economy if it didn't have nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, it does have 6,500 nuclear weapons, and hence we are where we are with them. And again, managing to try and serve as a rallying call for sub-Saharan Africa, for the global south, for the other disenfranchised. So that's one of the things we look at there. The next thing is shifting behaviors, and many of you that either come from Gen Y, Gen Z, or have Gen Y, Gen Z children or something will probably be quite aware of these sort of shifting behaviors, particularly lack of trust in institutions, which, to be fair, started with Gen X as well. But there is this feeling of institutional failure. There's a lack of faith in politics. There's a lack of faith in religion. There's a lack of faith in companies. And if you just go on the sort of anti-corporate threads on Reddit, you can see quite how vehement most workers are in companies. The fact that companies are evil, nasty, exploitative places to be. There's not trust in employers. It's often kept under the radar, but it is there. Certainly globalization is now seen as a bad word. I mean, I've worked with it for a long period of time, and I think it's a great thing actually on the whole. I don't see many places that actually find it to be poor. There are doubtless some places that are exploited. There always have been, there probably always will be, but not to excuse that. But in general, globalization has brought us closer together and it's made the world a better place. However, that is now seen as a not good thing. So we're seeing a lot more of that failure. And of course, nationalism as well. So we really manifestly see that in democracies at the moment, largely being quite badly affected by it. But of course, in more authoritarian regimes, it's a great button to press as well. And there is always that fear. Again, we talk about China, for example, that Taiwan, yes, they would like Taiwan unified. It's a thorn in the Chinese Communist Party side for sure. They've always intended to have it back, frankly, by 2027. Nothing new about that allegation. But they had other ways of doing it, that were bringing it together through a kind of worthy basis. Now they're looking more potentially at coercion as one of their principal tools of this. But again, it's a nationalist objective. It's not really an important political objective or geopolitical objective or anything else. It's a nationalist objective. And that has become important again in a way that would have been unthinkable, frankly, in the 90s, early 2000s, to have had that. So this is a volatile environment as a result. Digitalization. I mean, cyberspace, fantastic talking to you now because of it. I think if you look at the attacks happening in Italy and other countries in the last couple of weeks, we're well aware of the threats that can happen within cyberspace. And GPS is marvelous. It doesn't just tell you where to go in your car. It helps us do an amazing amount of things in business. If we were to start losing satellites and losing GPS service, we'd be in trouble very quickly. And partly because, of course, this huge technological efficiency we've built up allows us to have just-in-time production chains and, things delivered to you just at the second you need it. Jaguar Land Rover, for example, you can get, they want parts at the factory no more than 4 hours and no less than 45 minutes ahead of when they're needed. So for DHL and other companies delivering to them, they have very complicated systems to make sure that stockpiles are sitting around. It literally arrives when someone wants to put it on the car that they're assembling. That's great. And you can get rid of all of your fat that was your insurance policy, your resilience, your depth, if you have that sort of approach. But wait until your systems go down, your GPS goes down, you can't track things, you're losing awareness. That all breaks down and then there's no resilience. So the flip side of the technology is, of course, that it has allowed us to cut things down to the bone, and eventually you can't make any more cuts. There are, of course, also the tensions between service, security, and privacy of these systems. We know that. Again, TikTok, to be honest, no one I knew in the intelligence establishment downloaded TikTok in the first place. However, again, if you're worried about Chinese spy balloons, you should probably have a good look at what's on your phone and whether or not you have a DJI drone at home. There are lots of other things that happen with technology, and that's without mentioning the fact that we've more or less sold our lives to social media companies as the product, and that's extending now into physical health and even movement with things like metaverse and headsets and things that are picking up data on how you move and how active you are and stuff like that. We give away a lot in return for the services we have, and there are big developments to come. AI, we've obviously already seen advances with ChatGPT. The end of essay writing the way we used to know it at university, I suspect, but there we go. I'm sure we'll have AI to counter the AI soon enough, but on the back of that, and they're likely to partner with Bing. Google obviously now bringing out its own version. I very much doubt you'll be doing web search in a traditional fashion in as little as 12 months. I think 12, 24 months, and you'll be asking an AI engine to come back with the information for you, and you won't be sifting through 200 web pages. It'll come back and give you something. Now, there are risks with that because we've already shown you can teach AI to be biased, and there are lots of problems around the way things work, even without going to the doomsday scenario of killer AI. But there's a lot of stuff going on that's going to change how we work. Also, quantum developments, particularly quantum computing, but the The quantum algorithm cracking is a huge problem. Whoever gets there first is going to have an untold advantage in human history, frankly, to discover an awful lot very, very quickly in the intelligence space and even in the criminal space. Again, anything you thought was encrypted now isn't, until such time as it can be countered. That's not good. And of course, space and the rate of rocket launches going up significantly around the planet. There's a reason for that. You've seen the effect that a California-based company in the form of SpaceX has had on the conflict in Ukraine, and then the control of information. Let's now add control of the platform of that information as well as the messenger service. And again, you start to see issues around the way in which some of these domains are being controlled. So underlying all that as well is the fact that as technology moves on, traditional trades are going to go, and we have another revolutionary moment. And in history, these revolutions, be they agricultural, industrial, or anything else, have not gone smoothly. There's been disruption. Huge amounts of trades will be left. People halfway through their careers will have to retrain, and governments probably aren't prepared to put significant investment into that, frankly, because they are at a time, as we'll come on to, where they don't have the money. And that is going to be a challenge. It offers opportunities, of course, as change always does, but there are huge threats, I think, as well. So digitalization, again, very important. And behind all this, and actually helping drive it, I did say these are interconnected system violence. So heightened threats from lone actors, small groups. We've seen a markedly increasing threat level from the far right, of course, but also from the far left that's being overshadowed sometimes. Traditionally, actually, the far left was a bigger problem than the far right. It's now shifted. The far right's much more organized, but there's always a response. So basically all fringes, and of course, religious as well, and jihadist groups. You also see increasing aggression, not yet crossing over into true violence from single issue activists. But you have to ask, if people truly believed that the world was coming to an end due to climate change, they'd be more than gluing themselves to a freeway, or some artwork somewhere. And actually, as situations develop, and if climate change were to be as apocalyptic as some would put it, and I'd argue it's not, but nonetheless, of course, it is going to have impacts, then actually people might be driven towards more extreme action. And we've certainly seen apocalyptic cults arise in the past, that things as boring as a meteor or a comet coming by. So the extinction of most life on Earth seems like something that if you've grown up with it from age 10, being told that we're all going to die and people were the problem, eventually someone might decide that people are the problem and do something about it. The last significant example of that was in Japan in the 90s, but again, there are other chances you're going to see these sorts of more aggressive actions. They've certainly crossed over into violence against property, debatable, making a point, entitled to do or not, but at what point do senior executives get targeted directly in the way that we've seen political leaders get targeted, in the way that we've seen even actors and actresses get targeted, but actually will they come after the board of Shell because they're perceived to be the worst people since Hitler, if not worse than Hitler, and therefore someone says it's our duty to kill them? I'm afraid these sorts of things are growing. That's one small example, but that is out there as well. Again, I'm not for a second implying that's what most activists think, but there's always that risk that people are going to move further out. And then finally, post-COVID priorities: debt, employment, rising inequalities, stumbling supply chain, stagflation. And stagflation was kind of the worst outcome scenario. The US seems to be just about weathering at the right side, helped by this very buoyant employment market. But I think we're still threading a needle on recovery. It's worse for the UK because we've got the Brexit impacts that have caught us. We also had the war in Ukraine on top of everything else, and that's just a reminder that in a crisis, it's not usually the first thing that gets you; it's the second one on top of the first one, or the thing you just didn't see coming. So we could have all done better if we hadn't have had the energy crisis. Now that'll drive some other positive changes, but dealing with the effects of COVID and the fact that we weathered the storm by frankly just printing so much money, it was going to come home to roost. And I don't think we're looking at a roaring 20s as a result. I think we're looking at a sort of pretty long period of austerity, with most governments just not being able to do everything they want or need to do in an environment where actually you kind of wish you hadn't already sold the family silver, because you're going to need it now. This is the rainy day, but you already spent the rainy day fund, and that is the problem that the countries are facing within that as we go through. And I'll let Gareth say a few words about things in a second, but I'm just going to summarize that into these 4 business implications. So what we're looking at is workforce changes, insider threats. People are actually much less private about the data. There is a feeling if you worked on something, you can keep it. And that's pretty bad if you're working in a high-tech industry, but people just sort of feel that if they worked on a project, they're entitled to the IP. that's become quite a widespread view. So there's a lot of inadvertent insider stuff, but also our adversaries, honestly, are coming after a lot of information, and they're pretty indiscriminating about what they pick up. And a lot of what you read is actually only a fraction of how bad some of that really is in terms of the organization and the effort that goes into collecting intellectual property and essentially secrets from businesses. And it is sophisticated. Obviously somewhat enabled by cyber, but there is a focus on the individual people. You're also getting scrutinized for employees. Again, companies have been based on values, and lip service to values is no longer good enough. If a company claims to be environmentally friendly, it sure as hell better be, because people will come after it and check that. And there is nothing that people hate more currently than corporate hypocrisy. Or indeed, you can pick any high profile figure and point that, but it's particularly true of corporations. And that skills evolution I talked about, we do need new skills for a new age. And it's important to get ahead of that. And government response might well be to let companies get on with training a new workforce, but it's not quite as simple as that. And obviously SDSU and others are working on this, but it is an area that requires a lot of thought. You've also got obviously then policy pressures. Taxation is the obvious one. We've got to get the money back we spent somehow. How do we deal with that? Jurisdiction in a global workplace, a global work environment where companies are almost themselves completely remote. Workforces are completely scattered. Visas are almost meaningless now for doing business. There's a lot of things that need to change. And of course, for business, ESG, so environmental, social, and governance aspects, to what extent is a business responsible for someone who's working remotely on the beach in Thailand? Whose safety is it? It's just something to think about when we talk about global workforce. Practicalities are immense. And actually, if you are a US business and one of your people decides to go and work from Sweden without telling you for more than 2 weeks, they've just created a taxable entity in Sweden for your entire business. Now, it's difficult to see how you get caught for that, but were you to, the Swedish government could come and ask you for money because one of your employees did something dumb. So again, there's lots of challenges in this much more non-traditional environment, if you like, apart from the very thing of trying to get people to go back to an office more than 3 days a week. That's quite a challenge, as many of you possibly know. The geopolitical impacts, supply chains are vulnerable. We don't have resilience in corporations, particularly. We're seeing that with the chip shortage in particular, and now there's a chip glut. There'll be a chip shortage again. You can see where this is going. So that's the most obvious example of supply chain issues. Of course, the energy markets, always, they're very, very cost volatile. But this again makes it very hard to plan. That leads to lack of investment, and eventually leads to onshoring and nationalism again, nationalization of industries. So those are things that we're looking out for. And of course, economic pressure, and you live and breathe that. So I'm not going to go on about it again. US saying just the right side of it, UK probably just about on the crest of the wave it could ride, but there still is very strong risk of bubbles. And frankly, the thing I'm most worried about is shocks that could come to bear and impact us. And of the ones on this slide, I think we've seen nearly all of them apart from getting hit by a meteor. Space is probably the one that hasn't really come to pass yet, but we've had a big health shock in the last couple of years, more to come. Hazards apart from the environment, you've lived through things in California just recently that are considered pretty unusual, right? These are natural hazards. You can argue about the extent to which they're coming more often or not, but whether that's a natural phenomenon they're coming quickly or not doesn't really matter when you're getting hit by a tornado, or indeed a series of earthquakes today on 2 different fault lines in Turkey. Conflict, obviously Ukraine, but there are others to come, and Taiwan remains a concern. I think not for this year, but for this decade. And of course, many others that can take place under that. War in the Gulf was the thing we were most afraid of 2-3 years ago going into COVID. We had US service people quite severely injured in northern Iraq just before COVID really became big, when Iran fired missiles at US bases there. And that all went a bit quiet. But let's not forget the first time we saw drones being used against targets, with the Iranian drones we now see over Kyiv, they were actually used against Saudi oil refineries. And again, there's some stuff going on that could have very big ramifications, but more to extend around the Middle East again, for example. And of course, the economy. I'll stop there and just let Gareth, any particular thoughts about what's keeping him and the team awake at night?
Thank you, Justin. Really, really insightful presentation there. And I could probably go into each region and talk for 60 minutes on each one. However, I think I just noted a few kind of themes down, shooting from the hip here, that are coming out of the strategic risks we're seeing. And first of all, it's this diffusion of risk and the multipolar nature of where we're going. not quite back to Westphalia, but we're seeing we had the axis of the excluded in the annual forecast, and I'm going to extend that paradigm. Something we've been seeing is the axis of the pragmatic, to include the global south. And this pragmatism, I think, is not a direct corollary, but it has fallen out to the perceived lack of influence of the West. So we're seeing, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, discount Western influence in favor of Chinese economic guarantees and Russian groups as a security guarantor. We saw, South Africa notably shunning the West's prevailing attitude on Ukraine. You've also seen what is now a great game in Afghanistan again, but not between Russia and the West, but between China and India. So the vacuum, the vacuum left by the West influence in the AFPAC region is being filled. We're also seeing, aside from democracy in Israel, and how much will the US's traditionally strong influence in that part of the world be able to slow or stop that decline. So the diffusion of risk kind of follows from that, really. And whether we're talking about cyber or extremism or indeed global conflict, we're seeing the decentralization of threats. Terrorism was quite simple, even when I was kind of involved in CT work a dozen or so years ago. But following, for example, Islamic State's defeat in Raqqa and Mosul, where we're seeing an altogether more complex terrorist environment, extremism. Justin already mentioned the far right, the far left threat. I think there's been a huge diffusion in that space, but what we're seeing now is coalescing around certain issues, right? So that the far right have got their act together and now, present that real threat. And that kind of goes on to what we're seeing at the present moment is this grievance play out across the region. So, for example, the far right and far left threat that we're seeing across Europe, across the APAC region, of course, across the Americas. Is that a symptom of, in the 2008, we're seeing far right groups coalesce, around the anti-vax agenda, but now seemingly diffused single issue extremism groups coming together to pose that centralized threat, environmental activism. We're seeing that even more so than we have done last year. And the animal rights stuff, we saw that in the mid-2000s. We're seeing that pick up pace again. So whilst there is a diffusion of risk, we've seen Just Stop Oil in the UK, for example, break away from Extinction Rebellion. There is that kind of sense of grievance now that's driving these risk factors. Same with cyber as well. That hasn't gone away. And the diffusion of risk, we're seeing these criminal groups now actually breaking away from what we traditionally associate the nation state actors to do. It's no longer possible to attribute an APT to a nation state actor. There seems to be a lot more autonomy now in the cyberspace than there was previously. So, and we can say the same about the Houthi rebels, for example. A lot more autonomy in the extremism groups who are now patronized by the nation states, but don't necessarily toe the same line. So it's a far more complex risk landscape. But I mean, the multitude of risks we're seeing now, I don't think are new. That's what I would say. I think we've seen this before. If you want to know what's happening in the AFPAC region, we ghost wars a couple of times. The Kosovo, what's been happening in the Balkans, the tensions that we saw at the end of last year, it isn't new. Indeed, tensions between China and Taiwan. What we're seeing, I think, is a ramping up of what was described by one of my analysts as new normals. What constitutes for a normal year of tensions, in the Balkans in 2023 is an order of magnitude higher than what we saw in previous years. Indeed, if you speak to my APAC analysts, conflict between China and Taiwan, I'm sure that'll be a question at some point. Military conflict, less likely China are a pragmatic nation state and will only do something when conditions are correct. But what will the new normal be in terms of, I don't know, incursions into Taiwanese airspace? We've already seen that bar shift up. So we're seeing a ratcheting up of risk in these spaces, but a far more complex risk environment. And go back to the very first point, the perceived lack of influence of the West is maybe driving some of these nations in the axis of the pragmatic and the axis of the excluded to really weigh up their allegiances on an issue by issue basis. And those watching, Latin America now, Brazil, it's all good news. Lula is all good news. The protests in January actually shored up his mandate, but is he where we are on Ukraine? Not even close. So I think that's where the complexity lies in these nation states and these parts of the world and these geographies that have traditionally fallen down on one side of the fence and are seeing a gap now to, go their own path, frankly. And that refers to the global south in the main, but other nations as well. And Justin, just shot from the hip there, but interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. And yeah, and I agree completely. I mean, you can see, I think, from what we were saying that, we are in this, again, I put it more as a time of transition. And I'm not, the point of the slide I've got up here, I mean, I'm not running around with my hair on fire. Well, I am, but there's totally different business related reasons. It's got nothing to do with, anything in the world. It's got to do with HR. But it's the issues, it is the same things, actually. There's little here that's a true surprise. I mean, again, we predicted Ukraine, we tracked it. We, in fact, on my desk, by complete coincidence, I don't carry around with me, but we actually put the plan out that we derived with which Russian battle group was going down which road to reach which place. It was predictable. A lot of this stuff is predictable. Okay, the timing, the exact timing can often be uncertain. But actually, with a better view of risk and global risk, it is predictable stuff. As you say, it happens in predictable places. I think we get carried away by the fact that we have access to data, that people try and derive everything from underlying data, and they're not comfortable with that almost finger in the air bit where you have to make sense of an imperfect model. But actually imperfect models help us understand this. And I actually believe quite a lot in psychology as it comes to how the world shapes up. More than anything else, and I hate to say it to people at business school, but I think psychology is the single most important thing one can study, whether you want to be an intelligence analyst, a business leader, or just about anything else, because virtually everything in life is made up of human decisions, and these are just human decisions en masse. I think that is why these things tend to be in the same ways. We're still shocked when they happen, but we shouldn't be surprised. Of course, it's our job to make sure you're not surprised, but hey, they're still shocking, right? That actual moment, I'll never forget when I saw the first shots fired live over the internet in the Ukraine conflict, because something we've been tracking and talking about for over a year, was happening, and it's still very, very shocking. And I've worked on that since the mid-90s, in one form or another. So, it is the same places. But I have this here because there is good news as well. Our adversaries actually aren't doing all that well. I mean, Russia's not exactly kicking off in the battlefield in the nicest way. China is seeing upheaval over zero COVID, unsurprisingly. I mean, that was a fast for China. Okay, it might lead to worse things as a result, but it wasn't exactly a Chinese success story. Again, the problems on the planet are human success story problems. Too many of us, but that's success. We've kept people alive. There are more. People are having families. People are living lives. That's actually great, and business has played a big part in that. And even those more out there things are still very much a threat to us, but actually they're not performing as well as they did. People are becoming wiser. People are getting better at spotting misinformation, disinformation. We are learning and adapting to these very nefarious threats. And again, I just don't see, 2020 world's on fire. It's the beginning of the end. So 2020s, there's some challenges. Sure, it's not as easy as it was. And we need to be more intelligent, more risk aware, and more agile in how we do business. But this is not the end of the world. It really isn't. But there are some things to bear in mind, things we need to look at. And yeah, it will get more complicated. You have to put more thought into it. Business is no longer really, really, really easy, sadly. But the good news about that is if you can perform well in a challenging environment, then, you are a good business leader. I mean, you can be a business leader before, because it was pretty easy, actually. If you could raise money, you'd probably be a good business leader. I mean, now you've got to actually have the real judgment and the right team and everything else. So if you can differentiate yourself as a business now, this is the time you can do it. Before, it was a very level playing field, really, enabled by cheap finance and stuff. I think now there are opportunities to spot an advantage and actually be able to do something about it in a more competitive environment, frankly. And that means winners and losers. So there'll be some losers, but if you can win in this, you're pretty good. So pay attention in classes and lectures, I guess, is the subtext for SDSU there. Okay, that's it for our formal part. I know we've got about 10 minutes left for questions, a bit less than I wanted. We didn't see many come in the Q&A, so why I allowed it to go a little bit long. And again, a lot of the answers are going to be in the events to watch. So with that, I'll hand back to the dean.
Great. Thank you, Justin and Gareth, for your comments. Really appreciate it. Very insightful. For folks who are online, want to submit a question to the Q&A, we'll be monitoring that, and happy to make sure your questions get answered, do our best. So I have an opening question for you. So there's all these shocks that you're talking about, all these things that really are out of control for a whole lot of people, and they have to adjust on the fly. I think I'm sort of putting on my San Diego smaller business, medium-sized business hat, trying to figure out, maybe what markets do I try to step into, or, what is within my control? What can I do better if I'm running a mid-sized San Diego company to navigate this?
I think it's understanding what's going to affect your local dynamic. But HSBC had the strapline, even the smallest business is global. And actually, certainly, when I started, I needed a global bank account. My first client was US, that was 2010. So it was a one-person business in the UK. I was doing the US clients from the start. And I must admit, HSBC was my bank, and boy, they couldn't keep up with that, even despite the strapline. But, so much of it is extrapolating the global trends that are going to impact you. And the obvious one, for example, is energy prices. What from the war in Ukraine is actually going to impact you, because you can get sucked into the headlines and news, the movement, the front lines across the Donbass, none of which actually necessarily affects you. But the course of, obviously, potentially currency rates, something like that could have much greater impact. Interest rates. Actually, in the UK, I mean, the big thing that got everyone was the energy price rises. Got to the point that people were paying 4 times their rent for their premise in energy, and that's what pushed most small businesses under, was the energy bill. So hedging for that early. During COVID, I think, again, a lot of people focused on, say, survival. Well, you got to do that, right? Cash is king and you got to get through. But I think a lot of people didn't see that there was going to be a bill coming after COVID. So when the money started flowing from federal government and others, people got that, they spent it, it was great. There's a reason that aircraft went through the roof in price, and speedboats and fast cars have all gone massively up in price, because people spent the COVID money. Actually, business wasn't that bad. COVID assistance went on treating the directors. They had a stressful time. Of course, they needed something. And then, of course, now you're like, okay, tax rates going up. We need to reclaim some of this, a bit of a focus on fraud. And that's what's coming back to get people. So taking a longer term view in these things is quite important as well. So just because a crash is anticipated and doesn't happen, doesn't mean it won't happen in 24, 48 months. So I think resilience is the key thing we can all do. It's think ahead, build a reserve, work out the sort of, if you like, the cone of error of how things could affect you, and always have a hedge for that downside. Because I think in this volatile environment, you don't know quite what will come along and then impact something. Again, the pandemic, entirely predictable, timing of it, not predictable. Interestingly, I first heard about it and spoke about it in the Hotel Del at a meeting of chief security officers in January 2020, when we went in thinking this probably wouldn't be anything and went out convinced it would be. And that's when US businesses started to close down. But, you can't necessarily predict when something will happen. You can probably predict, you could see an impact, and how would you survive a 50% reduction in business? What would your plan be? And then, okay, what would have affected that? And to end the question, something we like to do with all crisis planning, which is fundamentally what we're talking about, I think it's working back from what really breaks your business and then looking at what could lead to that outcome, whatever it is. So bigger businesses, sure, but we work with a bank who had all their data centers on different power grids, on different water grids, but they were all in northern India. And so actually they were all right from a resilience point of view, unless, for example, northern India wasn't functioning anymore. Okay, why would that happen? Well, they had a nuclear standoff with Pakistan at the time. So actually you're like, okay, that event is what will break your bank. Your global bank will go out of business if there is a significant military exchange in India and Pakistan, which was thinkable at the time. Remote, 1% chance, but if that's the extinction of your business, you've got to mitigate that. So how do you mitigate that? So I think it's for any business, it's like start from what you can protect, start from what's most critical and build out from that. If you try and map everything in the world that could affect you, you'll go mad. So actually take the things that matter and build out. That would be my advice to this in this very fertile environment.
Appreciate that. You talked about AI and sort of the links to cybersecurity. You also noted that in higher ed, we're thinking a lot about that with ChatGPT now, kind of revamping the way we do assessment. But what are your thoughts on the importance of AI in the global business environment? Are you really going to see, some of the major actors, whether that's Microsoft or Google, sort of become even more prominent in terms of their influence on where the world goes? Just how do you see AI in the global business environment?
Yeah. We have a separate conversation about how you see it in the global academic environment, so I reckon your answers will be pretty interesting. But yeah, I mean, I'll keep it very quick because I know we're short on time, but governments are behind business in this stuff. I've done some work with the UK government looking at the implications of AI, augmentation of humans, etc., for the future. There's a very small number of people doing it. They produce interesting material. No one bases policy on it yet. We actually did a game for decision makers about how it would alter the future. And again, it's too far in the horizon for business to deal with, for government to deal with. So business will lead the charge. Business will, as we saw with social media, will lead it to places where the government's struggling to catch up. So, in answer to the question, yes, the people working on this the most will end up taking us to strange new worlds, without doubt, possibly literally in the course of a metaverse type experience and things. And there are going to be problems. And one of the things we've not got ahead of in all two new technologies is actually kind of red teaming the technology to prove how it'll be used adversarially. We didn't do it with social media. We do have a team actually embedded with one of the tech companies looking at exactly this, but they do fight a bit of an uphill battle because the whole process of Silicon Valley, Santa Monica, or Seattle, whatever, is to say, hey, look what we can do. It's done by well-intentioned people who say this is marvelous, it makes someone's life better. And I'm afraid nasty people like myself and Gareth and others look at it and go, cool, you can really disrupt everyone's lives by doing this thing with it. Drones, an example, weaponization was inevitable by threat actors. And people didn't design the threat out of the system. They just said, look at this incredible new thing, and then they throw it out into the world. And I think AI is going to be one of those things. There's a lot more awareness of potentially, again, consciousness of AI, or AI coming up with the wrong answer to the problem from our point of view, which is this job would be a lot easier if humans wouldn't stop me from doing it. And you program me to do the job, Sorcerer's Apprentice style. So actually I've worked out that to make better sandwiches, I need to kill all humans. There's that kind of, beneficial AI accidentally killing us for our own good type problem out there. People are very focused on that. It'll be more prosaic things that cause us challenges. And one might be, again, huge workforce changes that start to come. You don't need junior lawyers if AI can do a better job than you of reading all the documents in Discovery, can do it in 5 seconds and then tell you all the key points. So you don't need junior lawyers anymore. Now, how do you get a senior lawyer? That's a good question. But again, GPs, you don't need GPs if AI can do a better job than a GP can at triaging your initial problems. So those things are going to happen. And again, it's a societal change that will follow that I'm most worried about in that. But again, tech companies first, government policy, legislation catching up. We haven't solved social media yet. Sorry, Dean, you're on mute.
Gareth, 60 seconds. Any final comments from you?
I can go 60 seconds answering the China question if you want. We'll try to be more brazen in their acts. I think it's a hugely symbolic and political incident, but militarily, in terms of intelligence capability, quite minor compared to the ubiquity of Chinese espionage in the Safe Cities project. I'd probably look at China's reach into sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and further afield, and take note of the fact that if a country has succumbed to a One Belt, One Road initiative, their population centers will highly likely be under 24/7 ubiquitous surveillance by the Chinese government, the likes of which, you can't really imagine that's usurped by an order of magnitude anything that they can put in the sky. Although, as a caveat, I would be very interested to see what they recover from that balloon, whether it was kind of pervasive digital SIGINT, or whether it was just imagery. That's more a technical point. Really interested in that. But yeah, I think symbolically, the balloon thing is more of a diplomatic, symbolic, and political story than it is about espionage from the Chinese, which is ongoing, as I said, ubiquitous and here to stay.
Right. Appreciate that. Thank you, Justin Crump. Thank you, Gareth Westwood. Really appreciate you joining us at San Diego State University today. Appreciate your valuable insights and look forward to having you back again. To our people watching this, thank you very much for joining today. To learn more about the Fowler College of Business and the Wendy Gillespie Center for Advancing Global Business, go to our website, business.sdsu.edu, or our social media channels at SDSU Fowler. Thanks again for joining us today and have a terrific day. Appreciate it.
Thank you all very much. Huge pleasure.
Thank you.